Hello, everybody. Let's talk about La Belle Otero. It's a woman you see on your screen. So, in this age of the social media and the internet, it may be hard to appreciate the impact that the woman known as La Belle Otero had on the world in her heyday. Between 1890, when she made her debut in Manhattan, New York, and 1914, when she retired, this woman was more famous than any Hollywood star. Every single day of all those years, her picture and her name appeared in all the newspapers from Moscow to Buenos Aires. This woman wore $1 million worth of jewelry at a time for each outing. $1 million back in the 1800s. So you can convert that to today's money. Her clothes, her latest hairstyle, her moods, her rivals, her latest meltdown, her newest lover. These were topics that were considered as serious subjects that the journalists in the international press were focused on. Postcards with her image on them were mailed all over the world by thousands of travelers from Berlin to Chicago, from Vienna to New Orleans, from Madrid to St. Petersburg. So this is a book I read to prepare for this event, La Belle Otero, written by Arthur H. Lewis. So let's talk about Otero. She was famous because she was a singer and a dancer. But the baffling part is that she was mediocre at best. Thousands of women were better singers and dancers, and yet none of them received this over-the-top admiration and adulation that she got. One time, a critic blasted her so badly that she responded, "I have been in Copenhagen for 2 weeks now, playing to a full house each night. The critics say Carmen Cheetah can dance better than I, and that I cannot sing. But the house is packed every performance, and I spend each night with Willie on his yacht. In fact, Willie has written a play for me." And now you're wondering who Willie is. Let me tell you who Willie is. Kaiser Wilhelm, as in the last emperor of Germany, Wilhelm II. He was just one of many. She is described as the most dangerous woman of her time. At least 6 men killed themselves because they couldn't have her. So she earned the nickname the Suicide Siren. She had the wealth of a queen and the talent of a goldfish. She was called the most scandalous person since Helen of Troy. This is Valga in Spain. It's a municipality in an autonomous region of Spain known as Galicia. It's in the northern part of Spain, tucked away in the Iberian Peninsula, and surrounded by 1,000 kilometers of Atlantic Ocean coastline. Even today, it's almost isolated from the rest of Spain and has a mysterious and ancient quality to it. If you visited Valga today and walked through the Dios Masquera Park, you would come upon this statue of a woman known to the locals as Carmen Otero. And across town, there's a museum of the history of Valga. And inside, you'll be confronted with a permanent exhibit of this same woman. Why? because the inhabitants of Valga are very proud that she was born on their soil. Agustina del Carmen Otero Iglesias was born on November 4th, 1868 in Valga. It's said that her father was a Greek soldier. However, her mother was allegedly the village harlot, so who knows? The family lived in abject squalor. They were poorer than poor. Her five brothers did not know who their fathers were either. Not too much is known about her childhood, apart from the fact that she had an older sister named Caroline, who had died young. And so Agustina took her sister's name and added to her already long name. A horrible incident also occurred in her childhood when she was 10 years old. She'd been headed to the family farm to meet up with her mother, because that's what they did to survive. And along the way, some man jumped out from the woods, grabbed her, and assaulted her at knife point. He then dragged her into the woods, where he continued to assault her for hours until she lost consciousness. He left her with horrific injuries and a dislocated pelvis that took her almost a full year to recover and required surgery. She was never able to have children as a result of this rape. It was that brutal. She was lucky that there were nuns at a hospital somewhere in a nearby town who took care of her. She was totally uneducated, like not even one day of school. So she started dreaming about how to escape this wretched life that she was living. Home was a hovel made from stone with crumbling walls. The streets were muddy and crawling with flea-infested dogs. So she decided to take a chance on herself elsewhere. She ran away from home and left Valga when she was 12 or 14 with nothing to her name. For the next 2 years, she would survive by selling her body to any man who could feed her and give her a place to stay. She eventually made her way to Barcelona, her first time in the big city, and things were rough. One night, she had no place to stay, and it was a cold, stormy night. She managed to crawl into a shanty to escape from the rain, and she was crying when someone heard her and approached. It was a young Catalan boy named Paco Colli, and he would change her life. He was almost as poor as she, but he had his own place at least. So Paco took her in, cleaned her up, gave her new clothes to replace the rags she had been wearing. And for the next few years, they would live together as a couple. This is the first time in her life that she always knew she would have food to eat every day. Paco taught her how to sing and dance, but he also became her PIMP. He would arrange for her to perform at taverns all over Spain and would also find men for her. They started making better money and meeting high caliber clientele when Paco took her to the French Riviera. Now, it wasn't as if she was a good dancer. They say she danced like a bird and sang like a swan. But you remember that Shakira song about hips? Yeah. So Otero's hips could do that kind of thing, apparently. And so she began making a bit of a name for herself and was soon performing at cabarets in the French Riviera. The time period in which she began to make a name for herself is interesting in and of itself, especially in France. Here in North America, we called it the Gilded Age. In Europe, they called it La Belle Epoque. There was the time of Vanderbilts and Astors, the prime of Friedrich Nietzsche and Sigmund Freud, of Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, the time of the Wright brothers and Alberto Santos Dumont. the Brazilian father of aviation. The time of the Moulin Rouge, Renoir, Klimt, Monet, Gauguin, and Vincent van Gogh. It was a period of rapid industrial growth, characterized by transformations economically, socially, and politically. It is when this modern world we now live in was being reshaped. La Belle Epoque.
It was a very luxurious period, very luxurious. And the women's eyes looked as if they totally believed that forever and ever what they believed was going to be.
Well, the Belle Epoque was, there was never going to be another war, and everybody was having a good time.
There was an ice cream shop called Rumpelmeyer in Berkeley Square, where I, as a child, I made a pig of myself anyway, but I used to love eating their strawberry ices. They were the best ice creams that any human being would ever wish to see. They were, bar none. And now they're all gone.
My grandfather, he had a salt spoon, and on the salt spoon was about 4 or 5 drops of port, which he was giving this 2-month-old baby so he'd have a really good taste for fine wines. My mother almost had a fit.
But the society people, of course, didn't work. When my grandfather went bankrupt in 1901, my father had never been taught to work because no gentleman worked.
I miss the refinement of that period. I remember the dress of my mother. The inside of the dress was as beautiful made as the outside.
There has rarely been a time like it. Those who lived through those years would come to call it La Belle Epoque, which roughly translated means beautiful era. Now, from 1890 to the beginning of World War I, 1914, the world belonged more or less to fashionable society with a capital S. The wealthy and privileged commuted freely between the great cities of Europe and America in search of beauty and pleasure. Looking back, the era at first seemed like an untroubled period when the privileged lived in a kind of, well, you might call it a fairy tale, supporting the arts and inspiring innovation.
There was a fairy tale if you were very, very rich. But even if you weren't rich, if you played your cards right or caught the eye of the right person, you could move up in the class system and then reinvent yourself, especially as a woman. All you had to do was marry well. So even at this early stage, Otero began to embellish her life story a bit about her origin. Otero and Paco were in demand now at many clubs and cabarets in France. She began to amass a tiny fortune in jewelry for the first time in her life. It was mostly, little gifts from pawn shops that men bought for her. Her money was flowing in more from her dalliances with men than from her singing and dancing. So when Paco proposed to her and wanted her to stop seeing all these men, she said no. They began having problems from then on, and their future as a performing duo was not looking good. But fate was about to intervene in Otero's favor. During the Belle Epoque / Gilded Age, there was a lot of cultural exchange between America and Europe. Lots of wealthy American women got married into European nobility and Europe's royal families. And at the same time, lots of European women were finding stardom in America. In New York City at the time, there was a very famous Spanish dancer known as Carmencita. And she was it. There was nobody bigger than Carmencita at this time. She was the it girl of New York. You want to see her dance? Remember, there was no television or internet then. So theater companies were competing against each other to find the best live performers. This was a time when circus performers were huge stars. Everybody was trying to outdo everyone else. Just like today's social media stars, I guess. All the most exotic and best acts would get all the attention. So there was a 36-year-old man named Ernst Henri Jurgens visiting France at this time from New York. Jurgens and his business partner owned a waxwork business in New York known as the Eden Museum, which is sort of like Madame Tussauds. But Jurgens' place also featured musical concerts, magic shows, and marionette shows. They had a lot going for them. They've been hosting all these live performances, including vaudeville, was quite popular at the time. We've got a few of them. These people are all gone now. They're the stars back then. It was a corporate business, and Jurgens and his partner were struggling badly. So now that Jurgens was in France, he was hunting for someone talented whom he could take back to New York with him and fire up their failing business again. He had come to France because the World's Fair of 1889 was taking place then, and he was praying that he could find a Spanish dancer of his own, someone like Carmencita. Remember her? A beautiful Spanish dancer, preferably one with a reputation in Europe. But no luck in Paris. And so he went traveling through the rest of France, auditioning hundreds of girls. Hundreds. And then one night, whilst he was in Marseille, he went to a second-rate cheap show, and that's when he saw her. She was 19 years old at the time, and this is how a journalist described her. Otero's eyes are a deep, lively brown, which glow as brilliant as fiery opals. Her luxurious hair is silky and jet black and falls far below her waist. Her teeth are of perfect shape and look like pearls in her rosebud mouth. Her complexion is as soft and tinted as a peach. Her face is purely oval, and her pretty head is set upon a neck that resembles a column of white ivory. End quote. Sounds as if he's describing a work of art, doesn't it? She was very pretty, yes. but so were thousands of other women around France. What Jurgens got captivated by was her presence. She exuded sex in capital letters. Her singing and her dancing were nothing to write home about. She had no talent whatsoever, but the way she moved was electric. It's said that you could not look at her without wanting to take her clothes off, male or female. She was the most desirable woman he had ever seen. And he saw the way the audience at the cabaret responded to her presence at night. Now, Jurgens had auditioned hundreds of girls in Paris and all over France, but none of them possessed this quality that Otero had, not even Carmencita back in New York. Now, Jurgens was a good guy who had never been unfaithful to his wife. He was a very devoted husband and father. So after the show, Jurgens went backstage and introduced himself to her, and they became lovers that very night. He cheated on his wife for the first time ever. By morning, Jurgens had signed Otero up for a very lucrative long-term contract in New York City with top billing. She was going to be the star of the show after seeing one performance of hers. She was 19 years old. He was 36 years old and married with 3 kids. Otero dumped Paco immediately. Remember Paco, her lover of 6 years, who had protected her and taken her in? She dumped him like he was nothing, packed her bags and went off to Paris with Jurgens, who set her up in a luxury hotel. He was friends with a theatrical coach, a retired one named Bellini. Bellini had trained some of Europe's best dancers and musical acts, but now he had retired. But Jurgens wanted him to train Otero for a few months before he took her to New York for her debut. After the first session with Otero, this is what Bellini said. It can't be done. A year at least, and maybe never. She can't dance, she can't sing, and she has no style. That's how bad she was. Jurgens was not going to give her up. So he paid Bellini enough money to bring him out of retirement in order to coach Otero. That's how badly he wanted her. So this was October 1889. Jurgens left her in Paris and returned to the States to spend Christmas with his family. He also began working on Otero's PR and building her up in the press back in the US. He found her so irresistible that within a few months he returned to Paris to be with her again. Meanwhile, Bellini was training her as best as he could, teaching her how to dress and to develop her own style. He completely reinvented her, and her life story was totally embellished. In New York, meanwhile, there was already enormous public anticipation for the arrival of the mysterious Spanish beauty, international queen of dance, who had just completed a tour of Europe and startled the world's most sophisticated audience with her exotic performance. What? None of this was true. None of this had happened. But that's PR. One day, she would be the love child of the affair between Empress Eugenie and a Portuguese admiral, and then the next day, she was an Andalusian countess, or she had escaped from a Turkish harem, or she was the widow of an Arab sheikh. But she was certainly not a poor girl from Valga. They flooded the zone with tales of her mysterious origins until nobody could separate fact from fiction. Carmencita was getting very jittery about this competitor who was to come, and journalists began to ask her if she had known Otero back in Europe, to which she responded, I have never even heard of this so-called Otero dancing in Paris when I was there. And it was true. Carmencita had never danced in Paris either. She wasn't really Spanish. Firstly, she was the daughter of Polish immigrants had been born in the US. So Bellini got a top-rate group of 14 supporting dancers, male and female, to be a part of Otero's act, and all of them were far more superior singers and dancers than Otero, the star of the show. Bellini classed Otero up French style, but physically only. Her raw sex appeal was too overpowering, and they wanted to make it more subtle. They tried. Finally, in September 1890, she sailed to America aboard the French steamship La Bourgogne and received a huge welcome in New York. Thousands of people lined the streets to catch a glimpse of her. There were news articles published about her arrival, and Jurgens also planted stories about how men had been fighting over her in Europe, and of course pitting her against Carmencita. None of it was true, but it was very effective. She was wined and dined at the best restaurants and held a few press conferences. Jurgens practically abandoned his family and moved into Otero's hotel room at the Hotel Bartholdi, where she stayed. Every day, loads of journalists came to see her at the hotel and to interview her. One journalist published, "Otero is probably one of the most brilliantly beautiful women ever seen in New York." She didn't speak a word of English, and her Spanish was poor. What she spoke was the Galician dialect, Gallego. So it was her manager speaking to the press on her behalf, and he just kept making up wild stories about her. Now she would have to live up to the hype. When Jurgens found her in France, her audience numbered only about 50 people in total. And now she was going to perform to a crowd of 1,500 people at least, and New Yorkers who had seen the best of the best. Jurgens was nervous because he had blown all his money on her and borrowed more money and even mortgaged his home just to bring her to New York. And luckily it paid off. She had a triumphant debut in New York and became an instant media darling. And it wasn't just that she pulled these massive crowds to see her. It was also the caliber of people coming to her shows that surprised the journalists and surprised Jurgens. There were Vanderbilts and Astors, Bellmans and Ulrich, Wall Street titans, and very wealthy Spaniards and Italians all came to watch her perform. Carmencita had never pulled audiences of this caliber before. The women who came to watch Otero, they wore diamond tiaras to come watch her perform. Mrs. Vanderbilt was wearing a $200,000 pearl necklace, said to be this one, that had once belonged to an empress. Within a few short years, this pearl necklace would be around the neck of Otero. After Otero's performance, these are the kinds of people coming into her dressing room to congratulate her and bring her gifts. She was a star. Now, the Eden was the place to be. Her shows were always sold out. The house was always packed. She was the queen of New York. Carmencita soon got fired from her workplace. The PR machine behind Otero was so good that Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor, was intimidated. You know, New York's old money society really believed that Otero was a blue blood aristocrat. And so was Caroline Astor. But it sounded like Otero's roots could be traced back further than Caroline's. So they thought she was an aristocrat and that she was one of them. And so these prestigious New York families were soon inviting her to family tea and to dinner at their mansions. Good thing she didn't speak a word of English to destroy the illusion. Within 3 weeks, she had begun an affair with William Kissam Vanderbilt, her first multimillionaire. After seeing her for the first time, he sent his calling card to her hotel room, requesting an audience with her. They met, and he then invited her to dinner the following night, where he gifted her a snake-shaped diamond and gold bracelet from Tiffany's. He took her out on his yacht, the Alva. For the next 7 years, he continued to date her and gifted her $250,000 in jewels. Jurgens, her manager, knew he could not compete with the caliber of men she was beginning to meet, and that she would discard him one day. It obviously hurt, because he's the one who made her a star and brought her to their attention in the first place. The Spanish embassy and many other institutions soon began inviting Countess Otero as a guest of honor to exclusive events. Now she became a status symbol, and she hadn't even been in America for 2 months yet. That Christmas, an unnamed young man took her to his family's estate in Maryland and spent the weekend with her. In early 1891, Jurgens began to plan a tour of Europe for Otero. He had left his family by now and was deeply in debt, but he just couldn't pull himself away from Otero. He had a lot of competition by now because word got around that she was for sale to the highest bidder. She performed her farewell dance in April 1891 to a packed house before heading back to France. That summer, she would cause her first suicide. There was this Italian family of pantomimists traveling through Europe, the Donolfi family. Otero's coach Bellini asked them to coach her in pantomime because she was just so terrible at singing and dancing, and he thought perhaps she would excel at pantomime instead, and they agreed to train her. One of the sons began an affair with Otero, and he was smitten. He begged her to elope with him, and she said no. He was already married with kids. And so what did he do? He ran off and drowned himself in the Seine. Later that summer, the papers began to report that Otero was seen with Vanderbilt all over Paris. They were often spotted driving around Paris in his luxury carriage. They even got into a serious carriage accident, and she was injured, which would delay her tour. Her manager, Jurgens, meanwhile, was going through troubling times. He had been dipping into company funds to buy lavish gifts for Otero, including a $17,000 brooch from Tiffany's, diamond and emerald brooch. So the company fired him. He then fled to London before he could be arrested, because Otero's tour was starting in London. Her London debut was underwhelming. Nothing at all like her reception in New York. You trust the English. One critic wrote, "She dances with wild abandon, but with no discernible technique. As for her singing, the less said, the better." Years later, in a rare moment of vulnerability, she told a journalist about this period in her life. So one night, she was very sad, and she was walking around London at night by herself. And she took a walk on the bridge and looked into the water from the bridge because it reminded her of the river Ula in Valga, where she grew up. The river that flowed near the field she had worked in. She remembered how hard she'd had to work and how she would have to beg for food or steal food if she wanted to eat. She had a few playmates until she got raped. But once she got raped, everybody stopped talking to her. She became a pariah. People acted as if it was her fault. So the only people talking to her after the assault were the nuns who were treating her. It had taken her 1 year to heal from the injuries. And in that 1 year, nobody visited her, not even her mother or her siblings. And as she was thinking about this time from her childhood, someone tapped her on the shoulder. She spun around to see a young London prostitute standing next to her. And they just looked at each other for an eternity, as if there was a kind of spiritual recognition between them. She saw how tired this young prostitute looked, and so she took the woman back to her hotel room for the night and paid her £50. She always felt an affinity to women like that because she had been just like them. She knew how hard it was and how much she had suffered before Germans found her. From London, she toured Paris, Berlin, Brussels, Amsterdam, Vienna, Copenhagen, Warsaw, and St. Petersburg. In St. Petersburg, a group of Imperial Army officers were at a private dinner hosted by a very wealthy officer. It was a very, very lavish dinner with multiple courses. And then one time before the next course was about to be brought in, the host gave all of them black silk strips with which to blindfold themselves while the next course was being brought in. They removed their blindfolds to find Otero asleep on a silver platter on the table. She then got up and danced with them. She began to offer these kinds of private performances and would bring her even much more money because she was meeting all these very wealthy men up close and personal. Otero didn't care. As long as they paid her well, she would dance anywhere. But her manager got put off by it and he left her. So she began to manage her bookings herself. She returned to Paris in August 1892, and she was performing at a cabaret spot known as Belle Otero when she would find her next big jackpot. And that was this fella, Albert, Prince of Monaco. Monaco was still considered a joke at this time, but Albert was rich and a big spender. He sent her a string of pearls to her dressing room, along with a note that simply said Albert, and it worked. So she came out and met him. He set her up in a huge luxury apartment in Paris, and he loved to show her off in Paris, not in Monaco, where his American wife, Princess Alice, was. He didn't want trouble. So Otero was his mistress for 3 years before he ever invited her to Monaco. But we'll talk about that later. He continued to see Otero outside of Monaco and gave her a fortune in jewelry. But Albert introduced her to her two favorite things: fine jewelry and the Monte Carlo casino. She got a new manager, a Hungarian man named Joseph Kuhn, and he planned a 3-month world tour for her. She toured Melbourne and Sydney in Australia and did well, but she noticed that her new manager was scaring away the men who wanted to see her backstage, and she didn't like that. From Australia, they sailed to Cairo, Egypt, where Otero was surprised to find herself staying at the palace of the Khedive of Egypt, Abbas Pasha. She danced for him once and then spent the next 3 nights with him, after which he gifted her this fabulous ring that cost $250,000. When she got back from Egypt to Paris, King Nicholas of Montenegro was in Paris on holiday. He had seen her the previous year when he had come for his annual holiday in Paris. He'd spotted her at Maxim's, one of the Belle Epoque's most famous restaurants. This is where the who's who used to hang out during the Belle Epoque. So he'd spotted her here, but he didn't approach her because she had been with Prince Albert of Monaco that night. And one thing about these royal men was that they never showed jealousy towards one another. Rather, they seemed to share a sort of pride in dating the same woman, as if she had been stamped with the royal seal of approval. Yes, she's seen King Nicholas that summer, and also had her second suicide, a 19-year-old admirer who had sent her hundreds of notes to her dressing room and followed her all over Paris, but she had never responded to his letters. So one day, in despair, he threw himself in front of her carriage and was crushed to death by the wheels. It was 1893. In 1894, she got with her fourth royal, the 60-year-old King Leopold II of Belgium. She met him while she was out on a date with a baron at the Longchamp racecourse in Paris. So, dear old Leopold saw her from his royal box. He then sent a note to her inviting her and her companion to come join him in the royal box. And her companion, the baron, was very excited at first to be joining the king in the royal box. Well, excited until Otero discarded him and took the king to her apartment. King Leopold gave her a mansion in Ostend, a very prestigious region in Belgium, where all the super wealthy live, and where she had access to even more very, very rich men. It was around this time that people began to call her La Belle Otero, and she belonged to a class of women who were known then as les demi-mondaines during the Belle Epoque. This was a time when beautiful women ruled Paris. So let's watch 2 short videos about that.
And when the women of Paris were encouraged to dedicate themselves to personal beauty,
They always kept their parasols very straight. They were rather high, and then they came down and they didn't get any sun, and that was a very good thing for their skins.
beautiful women were the aristocrats of the day, inspiring painters, writers, and early photographers. And their clothing was considered a form of the fine arts. Paris was the fashion capital of the world, and Charles Worth was its king. The temptresses of Europe in the early days of the century were mostly entertainers from the worlds of theater and dance. In Paris, they were the demi-mondaines, and in London, they were the Gaiety girls.
She was trained to test the cigar for a gentleman. She knew how to select a chef. She knew everything about horses, about service. She took very good care of the people who took very good care of her.
Only the demi-mondaines were free to dye their hair and wear bright, extravagant clothes. They not only became the leaders in fashion, but for the Belle Epoque gentlemen, they were the ultimate status symbol.
They stood for something that was unique, that was glamorous, and my father said the The great joy of a young man at the beginning of this century was that he could take out a Gertie girl. You were really something very important, and you met her in your white tie and tails with a white carnation in your buttonhole, and you had your own private hansom if you were very dashing, and you took her out to Romano's for supper. And that was the sort of zenith that any young man could attain to.
Imagine that. Not only were these women the companions of the most powerful men, each of them was an institution in and of herself. Very intelligent women who could hold their own things. There was this place in Paris called Le Chabanais at the time. The place where these women would hang up from time to time. And to show you how revered these women were, when foreign dignitaries visited the French government, a visit to Le Chabanais was included on the official itinerary and was written as, quote, a visit to the President of the Senate. In 1895, La Belle Otero made her first appearance at Folies Bergère, the prestigious opera house and music hall in Paris. Posters. The night of her debut at Folies Bergère, her old friend Vanderbilt showed up to see her. His wife had since divorced him by now, but she got tired of his playboy ways. And he came to see Otero and he brought her a gift. Remember that pearl necklace we talked about? This one? That his wife had been wearing at Otero's New York debut? Yeah. He brought her this $200,000 necklace that night. A necklace Napoleon III had given to Empress Eugenie. Otero often wore it along with her other fabulous jewel, the equivalent of $1 million at the time. Good thing that Paris was so safe back then. As wealthy as she was, she often did stupid things that defied common sense. Like the incident that earned her the nickname, the Andalusian volcano. I think we've established that she was very rich, yeah? Anyway, so a linen draper named Capdeville had done some work for Otero, and she was not too pleased with his work, and she owed him 500 francs. Chump change for her, and yet she was refusing to pay, despite his numerous attempts to get his money. She eventually invited the man and his wife to her home to collect their money, and when they arrived, she wanted the man to beg on his knees for the money. And when he refused to do so, Otero threw a decanter at him. Missed, he picked it up and threw it at her. And soon it became a whole production with broken windows and guns, and the police had to get called, and she was taken to court and forced to pay the money anyway. Vanderbilt is said to have witnessed this, and shortly thereafter, he dumped Otero for one of the other demi-mondaine women, and it stung. She was quite jealous, but not for long, because she also got with Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich that summer, an imperial Grand Duke. And by the way, Otero was bisexual, and so she would regularly pick up women from time to time as well. Sometimes she would train young women on how to eat, how to dress up, how to apply their makeup, and how to please men, etc., like her own kind of finishing school. This is her volunteering, I guess. Otero performed in Rome later that year, and whilst there, she tried to meet with Pope Leo XIII. But the Pope refused to meet with her. Otherwise, we'll probably have had a story about how she'd seduced the Pope. Italians were very unimpressed by her performances, and they were brutal. They laughed her off stage in Bologna, and she never got over it. Even 70 years later, when a journalist brought it up, she flew into a rage and nearly punched him in the face. Another interesting story about Otero was about her rivalry with another demi-mondaine, Liane de Pougy, this woman. They competed over fame, over rich men, and over jewels. So one evening in the spring of 1896, Liane showed up at Maxim's restaurant, escorted by three men, and Liane was decked head to toe in pearls, emeralds, sapphires, diamonds, and a magnificent tiara. The following evening, Otero showed up at Maxim's wearing a long black evening gown, but zero jewelry. Behind Otero was her housemaid, a black woman who was carrying a chest. The maid was carrying a chest that was filled with all Otero's jewels, and they were overflowing from this chest. And the maid was wearing the exact replica of the dress that Liane had worn the previous evening. Sadly, that year, there'll be 3 more suicides because of Otero. One was an Italian man from Napoli who jumped from the 4th floor of a Paris hotel with a suicide note in his pocket. The second was a Polish count named Alex Pirowski, who blew his brains out. And the third was Jurgens, Otero's old manager, the one who'd made her famous. He was completely penniless by now. And the story goes that he snuck into her hotel as she was preparing for her second New York tour. He asked her for money, and she refused to help him. And so the next day, while she was on her way to New York, he took his life. This time, when she arrived in New York, she received a very cold and chilly reception. The media was brutal, and only high society men who were paying $10,000 a night for the honor were interested in seeing her. We don't know if it was because of her treatment of Jurgens, but things were so bad that Otero vowed to never return to America again, and she never did. When she got back from the States, she received an offer for a long-term engagement at Moscow's Imperial Theater. She took a quick trip to London in the interim, and that is where she caught the eye of the future King Edward VII. But he was still the Prince of Wales at this time. They met whilst both dining at Rules of Maiden Lane, the oldest restaurant in London, and a restaurant where King Edward had his own private door. They had dinner there twice, but the second one ended abruptly when Edward's official mistress nearly caught them together. So Otero headed off to Russia, where Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich introduced her to Tsar Nicholas II. They met at one of Tsar Nicholas's hunting lodges. This one really surprised me, given how devoted he was to his wife and family. Otero says there were always 6 huge armed guards outside their bedroom when she was with Nikki, and a guard at every window. She felt as if she was at a military barracks. Nikki was very jumpy and nervous, and this started from the time of his attempted assassination in Japan in his youth, which left him with a scar on his cheek. He was very unhappy in his marriage because Tsarina Alexandra was domineering and very superstitious. Bad Alexandra. His wife would walk all over the palace during the night, burning incense to drive away evil spirits, and praying with monks. Some nights he would wake up to find his wife standing over him, waving a lit candle around his face and chanting incantations. Imagine that. According to Otero, Zarnicki resented that the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, and Morgans were routinely named as the richest people on earth. The richest person on earth, according to him, was the Tsar of Russia. And he even gave a detailed explanation. You can pause this to read it if you're interested. So you can't even imagine the kinds of gifts he gave her. Diamonds, pearls, sapphires, rubies, emeralds, tiaras, watches, brooches, earrings, necklaces. So she made herself available whenever he wanted her. Even if she had to give up any performance, she would. The thing is, all these royal men had easier access to jewels than to cash. And so they chose to give her jewels all the time. She returned to Paris in 1897 to 2 more suicides and to resume a torrid affair with Edward VII. Otero was becoming a compulsive gambler around this time. She had always used men's money to gamble before, but now she was starting to use her own money. And so bit by bit, she started pawning off all these fabulous jewels that kings had given her in order to get cash to gamble with. And so she returned to Casino Monte Carlo that year to do some gambling. So there are casinos, right? And then there's the Monte Carlo Casino.
A true work of art built in 1863 that we owe to famous architect Charles Garnier, a unique place perfect for adrenaline addicts. The game rooms are admirably decorated with stained glass, sculptures and incredible allegoric paintings, an ideal place to try and break the bank. From the Europe room to the White room and the Médecin room, the emblematic private room of the Monte Carlo Casino, the atmosphere here is extraordinary. Built in 1910 by Monégasque François Médecin, this private game room houses the old elevator cage in cast iron that used to lead directly to the cabaret.
So this is obviously not a casino that you take 100 euros to. Compulsive gambling is a disease. It didn't matter if she won or lost. Apparently, it's strongly related to prostitution. And in Otero's case, it was all linked back to her time as a child when she got raped and her neglectful mother and absent father. Over the next 28 years, Otero will gamble away $20 million in cash at this casino. She kept a suite at the Hotel de Paris, which was just a walking distance from the casino. Casino would become like a second home for her. On this visit alone, she blew through $3 million. Not francs, dollars. And then off she went again to London for work at the Alhambra Theatre. Unfortunately, she was attacked by a jealous one on her way to work. The woman even threw a bottle of acid at Otero's face and only missed by a centimeter. Otherwise, Otero would have been disfigured for the rest of her life. Otero beat the crap out of the woman. And the funny thing is, She'd never even slept with the woman's husband. She had never been with the woman's husband. But the husband had been bragging to friends, and wifey had heard about it. There was a whole court case about the thing. As if this wasn't bad enough, Otero was invited back to Monaco for a 2-month stay after this incident. And while she was there, she would meet up with Prince Albert of Monaco in private every night. They'd have dinner together every night for those 2 months. Until one evening when he decided to take Otero out to dinner publicly. I guess he was feeling brave. His wife was furious. Otero left Monaco the next day because that story even made the news. And the prince followed her back to Paris, left his wife in Monaco and went back to Paris with Otero immediately and stayed with her and even took her out to dinner at Maxim's for her 30th birthday party. But he wasn't alone. Otero had 5 kings present at her 30th birthday party. She had Leopold of Belgium, Albert of Monaco, King Edward VII, Nicholas of Montenegro, and Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. And you know, these men, most of them were absolute rulers. This is when kings had real power, not like the royalty of today that are a joke compared to these ones. Her birthday was on November 4th, and by November 10th, Prince Albert took her back to Monaco with him and installed her at a royal villa. I guess he wanted to show his wife who the man was, who the boss was. 2 days. 2 days. There was a royal showdown, and then the police escorted Otero to the border of Monaco. The media went nuts over the story, and there were headlines like, "Jealous Princess Banishes Otero." But the exile only lasted 1 year because Otero's gambling had become an essential part of Monaco's economy. Imagine that. So Prince Albert's wife allowed her love rival to return to Monaco, but to stay away from her husband. Because Otero was the cornerstone of the economy in Monaco with her gambling. In 1900, Otero got her first car, courtesy of Tsar Nicholas, and she also changed direction in her career. She began to do pantomime. You picture her on stage. And she got rave reviews for it. In 1901, Otero was practically broke, having gambled away most of her money. Lucky that she had friends in high places, because her royal friends always bailed her out. And that's the year she got with Kaiser Wilhelm, whom we discussed earlier. So she got with him before returning to Russia, where this video of her was recorded, one of the first videos ever made. looks like she's having a great time. So Tsar Nicholas also ended his affair with Otero that year. And as a parting gift, he gave her a diamond necklace that had once belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. So aviation fever was in full swing in 1902 when Otero decided to pull a daring stunt to get even more attention. She would ride from Paris to Biarritz in a hot air balloon, but it was a captive balloon in that she would be in the basket, and then there'll be a rope, a strong rope, tying the basket to a car on the ground, and also a rope ladder hanging out from the basket, just in case things went awry. So she went on the hot air balloon ride, and it was a smashing success. Raised her global profile way higher than all the other demi-mondaines. And apparently, she became one of the first members of the Mile High Club with the gentleman who was riding in the hot air balloon with her. That same year, she got with the Shah of Persia, Muzaffar ad-Din. They met when he visited the president of France, Emile Francois Libé. He was ridiculously generous with her, and yet he banned her from ever saying thank you for any of the gifts he bought for her. And their affair continued until the day he died in 1907. All the jewels he gave her ended up being gambled away in Monte Carlo, like much of her wealth. Otero would stay anything from 4 to 17 hours at a time at the casino every day. She won $2 million once, but the rest of the time she was losing money because it was the gambling itself that she was addicted to. Apparently, gamblers are masochists. They like the pain of losing. And gambling was the one topic that was off limits with her. If a journalist ever mentioned her gambling, they got banished. Perhaps the proof to the press that she had not gambled away everything that was being reported. She showed up one time at an event when King Edward VII was visiting France on a state visit. He was attending an event at the theater, and Otero showed up decked head to toe in gems. We don't have a picture of it, but there's the way it's described in the book. You can pause to read it if you want to know how ridiculous she looked. And she was publicly humiliated when she was ordered to leave the theater because she was drawing too much attention. People felt so sorry for her, but also blamed her for her attention seeking. You would think that after all these years of being involved with kings, that Otero had gotten refined. No, she hadn't. She was the queen of vulgarity. Still very crude. She swore a lot. And she had zero discretion. All these affairs she was having with all these rich men and all these kings. She would talk about it with journalists and laugh at the top of her lungs. She remained herself. And perhaps that wildness was part of what they saw and liked about her. She was totally unpretentious. She got with the young King Alfonso XIII of Spain, who had come to the throne when he was just 19 years old. It was 1906. They went out to dinner at a fancy restaurant in Paris, not Maxine's. And they were being served by a Spanish waiter. The waiter nearly fainted upon seeing the king. He couldn't believe that he was serving the king. And when he saw Otero with the king, he looked at her with such disgust. Otero decided to piss off the waiter by being irreverent. She usually ordered champagne, but this time she decided she was going to order a beer right in front of the king. It just wasn't done. When you were dining with a royal, you didn't do that. So the king ordered his champagne, The waiter returned the champagne for the king and a glass of foaming amber liquid for Otero. Otero took one sip and then spat it out. It wasn't beer. It was pee. I guess the waiter thought that she'd behave herself in the presence of the king and just drink it or, not complain. He didn't know who he was dealing with. Otero threw the drink in the waiter's face, stood up right there and berated him, screamed all kinds of obscenities at him right in front of the king. She had zero fear of losing the king. She knew he wasn't going anywhere. The king didn't go anywhere and continued to see her. Around 1910, things started to change. Some of her paramours began to die off, starting with Leopold of Belgium, and others just began to lose interest in women with age. Socially, the tastes of people were changing. People preferred slender ballerinas now, and curvy women like Otero were no longer in high demand. And Otero adapted. She was in her 40s at this time. And she performed in her first ever opera, which was Carmen. She played the lead role, Carmen, a gypsy, a Spanish gypsy. And she did very well. King Alfonso invited Otero to Spain and set her up in an apartment. She had always avoided Spain because of the horrendous childhood she'd had. And so the king invited her as his mistress, but he didn't want people to know. And so the official story was that, oh, she was coming to set up a dance academy in Spain. And while she was in Spain, she did make one final brief visit to Valga, where she was born. People were unhappy about her affair with the king, and there was an attempt on the king's life within 1 week of her arrival. And so she left Spain and never returned again, dead or alive. When World War I broke out in 1914, La Belle Epoque ended, and Otero retired from performing, but not from gambling or from men. She claims that she raised money to help with the war effort, but there is no evidence to support this. Lots of younger guys who couldn't have been able to afford her before continue to flock after her so they could have bragging rights with their friends now that they could afford her. She continued to gamble and to downgrade her accommodations as she got poorer. She gambled for the last time at the Monte Carlo Casino in 1926. And eventually she got so broke that her checking account got closed down by the bank. But to her surprise, someone had opened a savings account in her name, and this mystery person paid in money each month until the day she died. She never found out who it was. To this day, nobody knows who it was, and lots of journalists tried to investigate. She wrote a letter to the mayor of Valga asking for her birth certificate to be mailed to her in France so that she could apply for public assistance, but she never got a response. She continued to sell her body until she turned 60, because even as an older woman, she was still very attractive. She lived a quiet life in Nice, France, staying at modest hotels. Journalists from all over the world continued to visit Nice, hoping to meet her and hear her stories, and she had so many stories to tell. On the rare occasions when she could afford to dine out at the restaurants or the hotels, the staff and chefs would fall all over themselves to please her. She would then return to her cheap room, which didn't even have a bathroom. She had a room that had a charcoal stove, a cheap armchair and table, pots, pans, and a small bed. That's it. That's it. This woman who had amassed the equivalent of $25 million in her lifetime was living like a pauper. She still had the pictures from the times past. She had just the memories. The last major event of her life was the filming of a movie about her life, and it starred the Mexican actress Maria Felix as Otero. They met and spent a few hours together. In the last years of her life, she was still a savage. With her words, she could destroy you. But she became more religious and attended Mass every day. On April 10th, 1965, Otero was making a rabbit stew in her hotel room when she died at the age of 97. She had bought her burial plot and tombstone and paid for her own funeral in cash 15 years before she died, which was good because she had no money left and there was no one left to pay for her funeral. Her funeral was very small and uneventful, except for a mysterious older man in a Rolls Royce that had a faded royal crest on the side. He showed up to put a flower on her casket before it was buried, but people couldn't tell who it was. It had foreign number plates. Love her or hate her, this woman left her mark on the world. She was the most photographed woman of the Belle Epoque, and one of the most well-traveled as well. Given her origins, it's amazing that she became emblematic of the Belle Epoque era. Like, what a life she lived, huh? What an adventure. When we look at pictures of Otero today, I can admit that the beauty doesn't translate that well in the pictures. Because she's attractive, yes. But the quality that got the world's attention was something deeper. It was her presence itself. One journalist from that era described it saying that being in the same room as Otero felt as if you were in the presence of an uncontrolled female panther in heat. This caricature of her with all the kings and all the men falling all over her. Felt like you were in the presence of an uncontrolled female panther in heat. And that female panther wanted you. Otero was an exhibitionist. She loved to show her body, and she enjoyed the effect that she had on people. She knew she did not possess any real talent, but she danced and sang with such wild abandon and joy that it didn't even matter. And even as an older woman, that quality in Otero wasn't diminished. There's a story told by an American tourist named Mrs. Eugene Wilson. So this woman and her husband were visiting Nice for their 25th wedding anniversary. It was 1938, so Otero was 70 years old at this time. The married couple had just gotten out of their car when the wife spotted this 70-year-old woman walking down the street. She said to her husband, "Wow, I wonder who that woman is. She must have been absolutely gorgeous when she was younger." And her husband stared for a bit and then exclaimed, "My God, that's La Belle Otero." And the wife was like, "Who?" So they approached Otero to invite her to join them for dinner. And the wife said, Otero had an air about her that is impossible to describe, the quality of a goddess. It seemed as if this 70-year-old woman was all the beautiful women on earth wrapped into one. It was as if she was looking at sex in human form. This married woman, who had never had any trace of lesbianism in her, said that she was completely overcome with desire for Otero, and it shocked her. So they took Otero out for dinner at a restaurant nearby, and all the staff were falling all over themselves, bringing them complimentary champagne and all Otero's favorite dishes unasked. She understood that she was in the presence of a very powerful woman. They stayed out until 2 a.m. talking, and they were the last people to leave the restaurant that night. They dropped her off at her cheap hotel and returned to their hotel. And she was just looking at her husband, and she wanted to ask him if he had ever been with Otero, but she decided not to ask. And later on, her husband would tell her a story about Otero and a certain hotel in Cannes. So her husband told her that the domes on top of the Carlton International Hotel in Cannes, these two domes, were inspired by Otero's chest. Make of that what you will. After Otero died, that old man in the crested Rolls Royce brought a fresh bouquet of flowers to her grave every morning until the day he died and stopped showing up. I don't know many women in our current modern era who can inspire that kind of devotion. What a life, huh? So we come to the end of this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed researching it. And see you at the next one. Ciao, ciao.